Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Someone once told me time appropriate greetings catches them all. My name is Dewan. I am your co host for the ShipTalk podcast, where we talk about the ins and outs, ups and downs of software delivery. And today, I'm beyond excited to have with me Alex Olivier, co founder and CPO of Cerbos.dev. Hey, Alex, how's it going?
Hey, good to see you. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Did I say it rightly? Like Cerbos, that's the right way to say it?
Yeah, absolutely. Cerbos, Cerbos.dev, for those that are into your kind of Greek mythology. Cerberus, the three-headed dog, the gatekeeper, authorization, security. That's the root.
Before we start, I must say you have a fantastic setup. Like your lighting and in your background. Can you tell our viewers and listeners what do you do for online meetings and podcasts and how do you have these crisp settings?
Great. I wish I had like an intelligent answer. Firstly, this is a fake background, which I think nowadays, I think everyone's kind of used to these. You can kind of tell when you wave your hands, your fingers don't quite look right. Though the rate that these like Sora and these video generation LLM models and such are coming along, I'm expecting to see some pretty funky backgrounds soon. Um, but big thing for me, like in the past life, I did do like sound and audio and light and all that sort of stuff for sort of productions and things. Is having a good mic. People can forgive bad video, people can't forgive bad audio. I would say is the main one. Though, problem with a very sensitive mic is I have a 9-month-old daughter, and you can hear her screaming in the background sometimes. So apologies in advance if that crops up.
The same thing for me. My son is at school now, but if it's not like he might
Yeah.
knock on my door time to time. And I have a nice like we're open, sorry you're closed sign on my door
Oh, nice.
outside. He suggested that just like the shops outside, they have this sign.
Mhm.
He needs a sign to know when he can knock on the door and when he can't.
Yeah, I've kind of gone down the habit of like home automation as well in the limited free time I have. And one of the things I've been wanting to do is like hook up my calendar to Home Assistant and then use Home Assistant to trigger like a light on and off outside my office. Just haven't had time yet.
Ah, that is cool. So tell us more about your background and how you co-founded Cerbos.dev.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background, I'm a software engineer at heart. I spent way too long in my teenage years writing bad software, and sort of fell into a career, I guess you could say. So, started off doing kind of freelance consulting type stuff, ended up at Microsoft for a bit. When I was at Microsoft, I was doing consulting as well, but working predominantly with large enterprise businesses. So name a big bank. There's a good chance I worked with them for a bit. The health service here in the UK as well. And the area I was always working on was like application architecture and security, particularly. After realizing I didn't massively enjoy working in a company of 100,000 people, I then went into the world of startups and worked through about half a dozen startups in various different industries, e-commerce, finance, fitness, supply chain, but always very much focused on like the data and infrastructure side of things, and moved into the dark side of product management, which is I know is a very loaded term, but one of the commonalities across all their experiences is that there were these systems I had to keep building and keep implementing, and there was no real anything special about them. They were just like commodities, so things like authentication, things like logging, things like authorization and permissions. And having done that enough times, and in one case, in one company, we had to build that system 3 times in the space of 1 year because the requirements kept changing. I got more and more annoyed that there wasn't like an off-the-shelf solution that kind of solved that problem. So myself, a couple of my old colleagues, in fact, one of my former CTOs, said, right, let's do this. Let's go and build a company and solve this problem once and for all for developers. And that's sort of where Cerbos came from 3.5 years ago now. I've been going a bit over that. And yeah, basically fell into this because I got annoyed at having to spend all my time thinking about something that wasn't really relevant to the core business. And now I spend all my time thinking about it.
That is nice. I can almost relate, not co-founding a company, but of course, working at big companies
Mm,
with hundreds and thousands of people, and also working at much smaller companies. You already touched on like the authorization and Cerberus and the link to the logo you have. But for those of you of the listeners who don't know about Cerberus, could you please tell a bit more about what Cerberus do and how it fits in the DevOps ecosystem?
absolutely. So, first off, I really dislike the word authentication and authorization because they sound very, very similar, and it's very easy to get those two muggled up. So Cerbos, we do authorization, not authentication. And to not use those terms and not to use the awful contractions of auth N and auth Z. When you think about authentication, this is about challenging a user to provide a credential. They provide that credential, username, password, passkey, whatever, and you verify an identity. You now know who this person is. Authorization is the next step, which, okay, once you now know who someone is, what can they actually do inside of the system? And this is a component that you need essentially at every layer of your business, ultimately. So down from, if you look at it from a DevOps perspective, you've got to make sure that your infrastructure, people that access it to do tasks, first you know who they are, so they authenticate via some mechanism, but then also should they be allowed to do this? So are you a manager? Are you an editor? Are you a viewer or an admin, etc.? And then from the infrastructure up, you need that essentially at every level. So the base infrastructure, who can get access to your cloud environment? Your Kubernetes cluster, who gets access into the cluster, into which namespaces? And then where Cerbos particularly focuses is in the actual application layer itself. Both your internal teams, but also your end users need to have permissions and controls around what they can do inside of a system. We're all familiar with signing up to some new Wizzy SaaS tool that makes our lives much, much easier. And we go and invite our team members on and we need to give them roles. So this person's an admin, this person's a viewer, this person's a manager. Basically, that component and the logic behind it, effectively, it's kind of commoditized. You have some business rules. You need to make sure that every request fits those business rules to make sure it's allowed or denied. And Cerbos is that engine that you can drop in to any part of your stack to solve that in a policy-driven approach rather than just hard coding application logic, which is the go-to approach, I would say, if you were to just start out.
Yeah, that makes sense. A lot of times, like concepts in software engineering, right? They're interrelated. Like you learn
Mm,
something in one field, you can relate to something others. So for my friends who are from the network engineering background, you might relate to something like a AAA threat model where, or AAA model where you have the authentication, authorization, and auditing.
yes,
So like a lot of, or if not all of services has some way to do all three, like you need to authenticate, you need to authorize, and of course, as good practice or nowadays, you must do some sort of auditing.
absolutely. And when we kind of think about talk about this space particularly, there's people know the AAA model, which is great. That's an amazing start. And there are a couple of kind of additions to that, I would say. So when we think about the life cycle of a request that's coming from one of your users or your internal services kind of hits what's the cycle and what's the journey that request has to go through for the actual action to happen. So you have some client, they are authenticated, request comes in through your API gateway, there's a JWT header associated with it. By the way, the authorization header in the HTTP spec really annoys me because that really is authentication, not authorization, but that's beside the point. So you have that bearer token. It goes to your gateway. You might have some coarse grain or medium grain authorization where you simply check whether that token exists and is valid and maybe contains the scope. And then your gateway or your service mesh will ultimately pass that down inside of your application. Now, inside of your application, you effectively know when that request comes in a few different things. You know who the user is because it's authenticated. And you know what resource they're trying to access based on the API call, and you know what action they're trying to do. So view, create, update, delete are the common ones. But when we talk about authorization at the application layer, I always encourage people to think more about what the end user actions they're trying to do. They're trying to approve a purchase order. They're trying to download a report. They're trying to comment on some asset, let's say. So what those are kind of the more actions. And the bit I'd kind of add in that journey is once you know who someone is, you now need to know the associated information with you. So authentication directory is what we refer to as, then authorization, then audit. Because once you've got an identity, you now need to be able to rationalize what that identity can do based on what teams or groups or roles they're part of. So this is where your classic LDAPs or ADs come in, or even just your own application database that stores this person's in this tenant or in this team be able to do access. Then you have the authorization piece. So use that context, who they are, teams, group, roles, resource, and action they're trying to do. Because now your authorization can be contextual based on not just who the user is, but what teams and groups they're in, plus the individual asset or resource they're trying to access. So only the owner of this resource is allowed to edit it. You can go and inspect the object and understand, okay, the ID of the user making the request is equal to the owner ID attribute of the resource. And then you want to capture that in the audit, which comes back to the audit side of things.
Yeah, great that you mentioned about, let's say, the existing clouds, LDAP, or their authentication layer and how this can integrate. So let's say some team is using something like OPA.
Mhm.
How do you say like this either is a replacement for that or complement to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we started building out Cerbos, we obviously looked at the market and looked at the tools available. OPA, Open Policy Agent, for those who don't know, is a very successful CNCF project. If you're writing policy for um, controllers inside of Kubernetes, you're most likely writing OPA policies, those kind of things. And OPA is a very powerful tool, and it can kind of do anything, which makes it actually very easy to then shoot yourself in the foot. So where we kind of see OPA used and where we see Cerbos used is Open Policy Agent is used very much for the infrastructure level. So be it the actual infrastructure itself or the cluster level side of things. And then where Cerbos is generally used is at the application level because it's a much more focused use case. And what we did with Cerbos when we first started, our initial hypothesis behind Cerbos was OPA was in the right direction, but the language you have to use, something called Rego, is very, let's say, it has a learning curve associated with it. And for the kind of the application use case, we wanted to make sure that this was something that was accessible not just to a developer, but also to the people that ultimately hold the requirements, which is the product owner, the product manager, the security team. So we kind of originally took the OPA engine and then wrapped it and put our own policy language on top, which is just YAML. We didn't invent a language; we just used something people know. We extended it with Cell, a common expression language for defining conditions, and that got traction. It kind of proved the model, and we ended up ripping out OPA to generate our and created our own much more focused and performant ultimately engine because we were really targeting the application permission use case. So we very typically see OPA used alongside Cerbos, just at different parts of the stack. And it gives a very kind of different experience. One's very DevOps focused, one's much more business and security team focused, which is what Cerbos does.
Thanks for clarifying that. So now that we have some idea about like what is Cerbos, let's switch to the developer productivity.
Mm.
It's a common dilemma that like developer wants speed, but also there's security teams not so fast. So how do you see, because you are in this space, how do you see this dilemma, like making developers move fast, but also with security?
Yeah, absolutely. So the alternative of not using some sort of policy engine, of which there are some great solutions out there, is you end up building it yourself, and you're going to end up wasting realistically a few months at minimum. Having done this myself, I've seen it take everywhere from a couple of months to a full year to build these systems out properly. Um, and that would be to build a system that meet the requirements that come from the business or the security team at some moment in time. What inevitably will happen is as your business grows and evolves, the application of all permissions, so we're not talking about the infrastructure, but the actual application, the external service that you're providing to as a business, the requirements in there will change. They'll change because you're adding functionality and your sales team want to package up access in different ways based on how they want to sell it that particular month. Hopefully not month, maybe twice a year they might change the packaging. You might be scaling out the business to other parts of the world and you need to start enforcing data locality and data access controls based on location. You might start reaching a point where you want to go and get your compliance certificates, so your SOC 2s, your ISO 27001s, those kind of things. Both things I've been through multiple times now. There's requirements in there that you have to meet from a security side of things. So you have to go and implement audit logs as part of that. So you'll be able to demonstrate, not only have, but also demonstrate to your auditor. I used to get dragged down to a dark, dingy basement every year by an auditor in a previous life and had to demonstrate our access logs, which at first was grepping through S3, which wasn't a good look, I will admit. But these are all kind of capabilities you need to add. And if you spend time building that yourself, it's the same old story that every dev tool will provide you is it's you're going to waste time and it's undifferentiated. You really should focus your engineering team on what you do as a business. Um, and that was kind of the approach with Cerbos. Like you shouldn't be building this thing. To that extent, Cerbos, the engine, the policy decision point, this is called, is fully open source. Grab it off GitHub, fork it, Apache 2 license. You're free to do as with it as you will. And we have thousands of companies out there running Cerbos as is today. So from a developer productivity perspective, step one is we save you building a whole engine. You can just go and grab it. It runs another service. It's a little Go microservice, gRPC or HTTP interface. You just hook it into your application. At that point, once you've done the integration once, you can essentially hand off to the product team or the security team or whoever wants to manage those policies And you can basically give it back to the people that had the requirements, say, cool, we've implemented it. You're now free to evolve and change what these policies need to do. Obviously, there's guardrails in there. You can write full test suites against it to make sure things don't break. But really, from a developer productivity, it's a one small piece of work, which is to do the integration and have your DevOps team deploy it as a Helm chart or a Cycle or whatever makes sense for your system. And then you can basically hand it off to the people that are making the business decisions around what the policies need to be, and also can update those and evolve them and change them without having to come back to the dev team every time you want to change the packaging or add some new clauses or checks in there based on some new regulation you're relying on. So really, it's a developer productivity boost in the sense that you now have a one-off job to do, which is set up an integration. Once it's done, you can effectively be hands off. You don't need to think about authorization in too much detail ever again. There's always going to be edge cases, but that's primarily how we see Cerbos being used in businesses, small and large, today.
And I'm sure like you have seen many, many implementation of Cerbos and like similar tools by engineering teams.
Absolutely.
And what sort of like the right time to adopt this tool? And the context
Ah,
of the question is, so let's say I'm an engineering manager. I'm making my team, hey, like you have to build a web app. Okay, now we have the POC. Now let's see if we can add a CI. Okay, now we have a CI. So let's say what's the right registry? And okay, now CD. Okay, now let's make sure that we're using secret managers and so on.
yeah.
So like slowly, slowly, this is evolving, right? And then maybe like the nirvana would be like we're having everything from metrics to logs and
Mm.
policy and authorization. So where do you see like the sweet point of adding these kind of tools?
This is an excellent question that I don't get asked very often. So we generally see the adoption of what's referred to as kind of an industry and by the analysts as externalized authorization or runtime authorization solution at 2 points in time. First point in time is you're at the start of a new build. You've done your first POC. You've kind of got an idea of what's going on, but now you want to kind of build it properly, as it were. Um, and this is where we see the types of engineers and engineering managers and developers and product teams who have felt this pain before and have in previous companies had to gone in and rip out how their access controls or permissions or overhaul their permissions have worked previously and know how much of a time sink and how much of a pain and how much of unnecessary work you end up doing. And so it's like, right, we're going to put something like Cerbos or one of these other solutions in from day one. Initially, it's going to be it's going to do a simple role-based check. That's it. It's not very complicated, but the foundations are in there. And then you can kind of forget about it until your requirements change and maybe you have to update the checks a bit. But the the muscle memory is there in terms of having your application code call out, do a permission check, and get an answer back, which means you're now kind of decoupled. The second time, and the second kind of cohort of people we see and come to us and start adopting this an externalized authorization approach is when businesses are either going through a bit of a re-architecture, so monolith to microservices, or we're now in this world where actually we're going back to monoliths. But anyway, um, and essentially you need to start breaking down your application into sensible components, either to make them a modular monolith or to make them microservices. Either way. Um, and one of the first components that you pull out is authentication. So you go and set up an IDP. If you want to keep it open source, you can go and use something like Keycloak, Super Tokens, or many other ones that are out there today. Um, and then once you start bringing kind of extracting that out, then one of the next things is like, okay, well then how do you manage permissions? And as soon as you move to microservices, you now potentially have services written in different languages. You might have something in Java, you might have something in Go, you might have some stuff in Python because you're going to do AI. Um, then you now need to, okay, we need this sort of common service that handles the permission checks. And this now, by the fact you're in a heterogeneous microservices architecture, it can't be like something you just put in code inside of each service itself, because every time those requirements change, you're going to have to go and update that if else case switch style logic across n number of languages, which is obviously going to cause a bit of pain. So that's the next point where externalized authorization kind of comes up as a kind of key thing to do. So it's the new builds, get it in from the day one, not worry about it again, or it's the re-architecture phase. Um, there's a bit as well, if you work in regulated industries, the importance of doing this sooner rather than later will vary. If you're going to, we have case study with a fintech company In Southeast Asia, they actually managed to get their banking license 3 months faster because they were using Cerbos for their permissions because of the audit log, which is just such a hard requirement for those industries. So there's always a bit of an industry and a vertical lens to apply on the importance of such things. Um, and kind of those are the 2 points we generally see this kind of approach being implemented.
Yeah, I can totally understand like the experienced eye point. Like
Mm.
you've felt this pain before, and then whenever you start a new project, you start to look for that first. That's I don't want to get burned by this
Oh
again.
yeah. Yeah, like today, say if you go back like 10 years ago, you need authentication in the system. Cool. I'll go and create a user table with a username and password column, or hopefully a sort and a hash column. And all good. But then you fast forward to be now in a world where you have to support single sign-on, you have to support social logins, you have to support passkeys, you have to support XYZ. Are you going to spend time building all that, or are you going to go and pick a solution off the shelf that has all that baked in and you just plug it in? And more often than not, those solutions are actually open source, much like Cerbos, which is great. Um, and we're if you think at kind of where things are financially in the global markets, money isn't necessarily as cheap as it used to be. So you really need to make sure as a business what you're spending your time on is really focused, and you're not reinventing the wheel for these components that you can just plug off the shelf and plug in.
Totally. And then we're also not talking about our human users only. So before
Mm,
it was primarily our human users. Now it's human users and machine users, which would be like
absolutely.
10x or 100x or even 1000x. And those are short-lived. So you constantly keep creating short-lived tokens, short-lived services. So that authorization layer just becomes that more complex.
Yeah, and the buzzword around this, I say buzzword, it's quite an old idea now, but zero trust. Never trust, always verify. You need to do authorization, preferably policy-based authorization, everywhere in your stack. And those identities, like you say, aren't just necessarily humans. They could be non-human identities. They could be agents. We're seeing more and more service-to-service authorization as well. But you want to actually pass through the top level, the end user making a request, pass their identity down the chain, but then also have each service authorized to each other. So there's an explosion of identities and different surfaces to authorize across, from the bottom of the stack all the way up to the end user. And having a policy language and a policy engine that's kind of agnostic to whatever the identity is going to be a real advantage to you because you'll have one way of doing things that works across human, non-human, AI agents, etc. In your architecture.
And what would you say the options? Because nowadays, what we don't lack is we don't lack options. There's just too
Hmm.
many options when it comes to dev tools, security tools, scanning tools. So let's say a team wants to get started with the AAA, like
Hmm.
although you're in the specialization of authorization, you have experience with the other two A's as well, the
Yeah, absolutely.
investigation and auditing. So let's say what are and again, if we stick towards like the open source side, like what are the
Yep.
options they have?
Yeah, so thankfully we are quite lucky now in the authentication space. There are a plethora of vendors. Um, your existing cloud providers, if you're deployed on cloud, will have things like Entra ID or Google IAP, or um, Cognito in the Amazon world. If you want to look at a pure open source solution, Keycloak is the one we probably see the most. It's a CNCF backed project for those of you that haven't heard of it. But there's also things like Supertoto and Citadel, as well. And it feels like there's a new authentication provider every other week appearing on Hacker News or IC's backing. So that's a very kind of a rich world. On the authorization side of things, there's really two camps for this. There is a policy-based approach, which is what Cerbos is, it's what OPA policy agent is, as well. And then there's the Zanzibar-based model. So Zanzibar was a white paper Google put out about 8 years ago now, which kind of explains the permissioning model behind Google Drive. So you have millions, if not billions, of resources, and you want to be able to give arbitrary access to any point of the tree in the hierarchy. And there's open source implementations of that as well. If you need that kind of model, it really just depends on your business requirements. And then on the audit side of things, a lot of time this is kind of baked in to a certain degree to your authentication or authorization layer. But there's also some great sort of standalone audit systems as well. Boxy HQ is one that we've kind of worked with in the past and partnered with as well, which gives you this kind of nice sort of audit capability of tracking actions and works very nicely with the authorization and the identity layer.
Shifting gears, let's talk about Cerbos Playground. Back in
Mhm.
my Red Hat days, we had OpenShift Playground.
Yeah.
No, there's a OPA Playground, Cerbos Playground. Talk to me like how the team thought about like building the playground, the need for such playground, and how other companies can learn and build this playground for developer self-onboarding.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're building or when you're kind of building out at least any sort of infrastructure or developer sort of operations, developer tools type offering, there's always going to be some level of effort to basically get a local instance stood up, whether that's just like launch Docker container or apply a Helm manifest to a Minikube instance or whatever. Um, and there's that kind of friction to kind of get to seeing the actual value of the thing you're playing with or getting to that aha moment with my product hat on that I'm always focused on. So very early on with Cerbos, we said, right, we've got this engine. We know it's functional, but how can we get more eyes on it? How can we get more people to like kick the tires? How can we get more people to try the policy format? Because we took a bit of a gamble with YAML, but it's paid off. People know YAML, love it or hate it. It's very much here to stay. There's great tooling around it. So I was like, okay, well, if we rather than this, what can we do to remove the requirement to stand up an instance locally? What can we do to give that instant feedback? So the Cerbos Playground is this is just a web-based IDE. Looks very similar to VS Code. Behind the scenes, we actually run a version of Cerbos, and you can interactively write policy and also define like reference fixtures. Okay, here's an example user, here's an example admin, here's an example customer, here's an example manager, and then also define some reference fixtures for different resources. So here's a purchase order that's approved in the US. Here's a purchase order that's pending in EU. Here's a report which is published, etc. And you define kind of what those objects look like, what the attributes associated with them are as well. And then in this playground, as you're working on your policy, you're getting that real-time interactive feedback loop of what access is denied or granted for those particular combination of users and resources. So literally, as you type in the browser, not only are we evaluating your policies, and once you have a valid policy file, it will sort of start showing you what's allowed and denied. But also, the moment you change it, it's going to update. And then one of the other kind of components in there as well is with Cerbos, we also not only let you write policies, but you can also write tests against those policies. So you take those reference fixtures and resources, principles and resources, and say, okay, what's the expected decision here? This should be allowed, this should be denied. And you can do a full test-driven development approach. And then every time you change your policy, we rerun those tests and give you that instant feedback of what's going on. So that playground really is allowing you to play with what your business logic is and making sure it's matching those requirements that are coming from your product team or your security team, and make sure your policy is really reflecting what's going on. Um, and then it starts giving you a bit of a hint of like, okay, what does this actually look like in real life? So you can start seeing what the API calls would actually be between your application and your uh, Cerbos instance, and what is the chatter over the wire looking like, so you can really understand and get a feel for what's going on. You can see what the audit logs look like. You can see what a query plan looks like. We even allow you with like one click to start up a Cerbos instance on your local machine that's connected real time to that playground. So you can interactively in your browser update policy, and your local instance is now updating live. So you can start testing out the actual integration between your application and a Cerbos instance without having to spin up a production instance somewhere. And so it's all about getting to that moment where you go, okay, yeah, I understand how this works now. I've played with it enough. I've tinkered with it enough. That's at least how I learned the best. And we wanted to make sure we had that from sort of day one, and we've been evolving it ever since. So the original code base I wrote about 4 years ago, which thankfully has been rewritten many times now. And we've been building and improving it based on kind of feedback and usage. And as we add more features to Cerbos, they appear first in the playground for users to test with.
And when you mentioned about like writing tests for Cerbos as well, I thought the Java developer you meet is telling like I have to write unit test and I have to write down test for the policy tool.
Well, if you kind of, I'll tell you why we kind of did this. So obviously you want to make sure your logic is correct, and testing authorization logic, if it was hard coded in your application, gets tricky because you need to actually have the whole application working. You need to have the database calls, you need to have the authentication system working, you need to have X, Y, Z. So we were like, okay, what's the smallest footprint we can do to allow you to test your policies in isolation? And so that's essentially what we have with the Cerbos test suites. They are essentially kind of unit tests for your policies. They are isolated. You can run them in your CI, etc., in isolation, without having to worry about spinning up the entire application for an end-to-end test, which you still should do, but this allows you to iterate much faster just on your policy.
Yeah, and also with the LLMs, we don't have to like write by hand
Mhm.
all the test for the policies as well. We might
Yeah,
generate the test and then just validate that those are working as expected.
absolutely.
No.
Yeah, I quite regularly check all, ChatGPT and Claude and all these ones to see how well they can generate service policies, and they're getting pretty good now.
Yeah, yeah, the more data points they're getting. Switching gear to the trends.
Mm,
Um, of course, like whenever we talk about trends, there's very difficult to avoid the ML and AI and all those.
yeah.
Uh, I don't know what the right adjective to use, but thinking about the DevOps trend, let's say if we take one more generic approach, not just the authentication or authorization, the DevOps trend in general. So before we used to have like QA team, like
Hmm.
groups of people who test the code. But nowadays, for most startups, you don't see like a team of QA. You see like
Yeah.
developers writing their own code and also testing that code. So how do you see the trend in DevOps for developers more and more? They're sort of owning and managing their authentication and authorization for apps rather than having the DevOps person or DevOps team doing that.
Good question. And my view is very much tinted from being in small startups. So previous one when I started there was what, 30 of us. One after that, I was employee number six, I think, after that. And so always been quite small. I've never had the luxury of a dedicated QA team. And when I look at it through that lens, it's always been very much like let's create it's such an overused term these days, but like a full stack team, and aligning around features and capabilities. So within that, you might have someone in that team. You got a product person, you got a UX person, you've got front end, back end, and DevOps all working very closely together um, on it. And really, what you're trying to do is trying to reduce the amount of do some work, hand it off to another team, wait for them to do something, and then come back. By the teams I've built in the past, by having that kind of full stack team, we've been able to actually ship much faster. And I think you talk about like AI and all the LLMs, all this stuff. There's some pretty scary, but also great tech coming out. And ultimately, what I look at it as is how can this make us as a full stack team produce better content faster or better applications faster. So that's kind of the way I view things. Shift left is a term that's used quite a lot. Um, Having those common functionalities, authentication, authorization as something needs to own it, but you shouldn't have to build it. I think it's going to become more and more, and we'll start seeing more off-the-shelf components being dropped in to systems and into these full stack teams who can actually just set up once it's integrated and move on to kind of the next thing. Um, and have a system that kind of can iterate and move quite quickly on top.
And by now, our listeners and viewers must be thinking like, how can I get involved? Like, what's next for Cerbos? What's coming next for Cerbos, and how can folks get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of two things here I want to talk about. One is um, in the past year or so, there's been a real drive amongst sort of authorization vendors and thought leaders around how can we start standardizing what authorization looks like. And there's an ongoing effort called the AuthZen Working Group, part of the OpenID Foundation, which Cerbos we're a part of. And it's all about kind of standardizing the interface around authorization, how it integrates into applications. Our hope here is the OpenID Connect moment will happen, but for authorization as well. And the reason why that is important, if you look at what's happened with login and single sign-on identity, you can now today go to some SaaS vendor, some commercial off-the-shelf product, and plug in your own IDP, plug in your own SAML and OpenID Connect type interfaces, and now you have that federated identity, and that's done over a standard interface. Where authorization, in my view, goes is that similar kind of interface. So if you were to go and buy name some big box software that you use inside of a business, be it CRM, ERP, or some SaaS product you're using. As part of your onboarding, you go step one, connect my IDP and do federated identity and single sign-on, and step two, plug in my business's authorization system as well. Because building authorization just for the application layer is one thing, but really as a business, you also want to have that same level of control of other systems that as a business you're using. So there should be a single point where you define what a manager inside of a business, what a user in the North America office can do, what a an auditor can do, and you should be able to define that centrally. And then every system you build, be it an internal tool or an external system, should be able to hook into that authorization layer, so you don't have to go in and provision access in 10 different systems whenever if someone joins, moves, or leaves a business. So I guess the ask there is if you're listening to this and you're thinking around like, oh, I'm building a system and this is kind of interesting how we could hook into authorization, please come along. It's a open forum, the OpenID Auth Working Group. We're always looking for software vendors to kind of bring their use cases and requirements so we can make sure the standard fits that. So the API on top of Cerbos will be Auth compliant as we start ratifying those versions. And that's all about how we can make sure that authorization is as easy as possible to integrate into any application, not necessarily ones you build yourself. And you can find out more about that on the Cerbos website as well. And then where we're going with Cerbos itself, we have kind of a number of releases coming up. Shortly, the thing we've just rolled out recently is a view inside of our management control plane, which we call Cerbos Hub, which aggregates all your audit logs into a single interface, and that's really designed for security teams to use. Up until now, we're very much developer focused, and we've started bringing on product managers to kind of manage policies themselves in that kind of playground style environment. And then the next kind of set of users inside of a business that are like asking for like help in order to do their job ultimately is these security teams. And for example, CISO at a large business, they kind of get identities that have had a suspected breach. So they need to go and pull out all the actions that have been happening inside of their application in order to fulfill their own um, compliance, or so maybe it's an external customer. A lot of the logs and the kind of the audit of AAA is kind of just dumped out to some log capture system, be it something inside of your cloud provider or Elastic or Datadog or those kind of tools. And that's very like developer focused. It's just like the application, the raw application logs. The UI is designed for someone that's happy to write, JSON paths, style searching, those kind of things. And the data retention as well is going to be based on data volumes. You might have only 30 days worth of data. From a compliance and a security point of view, you need firstly a very different UI. You need something that someone that isn't necessarily a dev or a DevOps person can operate, and you also need data retention that's much longer than that. There's legal requirements of multiple years, if not longer, depending on your industries and verticals, to kind of keep authorization and access control logs. So that is something we've rolled out and we're building on top of right now inside of Cerbos. So you get that UI, you get that interface as part of our managed control plane that complements the open source decision point that runs in your stack.
That sounds great. And in such a short time, you're able to tell our listeners like the past, present, and future or trends of servers. What would be like a few words you can use to summarize servers? Would it be like the authorization layer friend for the developers? Like, do you have any catchy phrase that you used to explain, let's say, servers in a few words?
My go-to is don't reinvent the wheel, and I think that's just general advice. Authorization is one of those wheels that you could get stuck reinventing with kind of what's going on with your application and how the checks are done. But I would say Cerbos ultimately is fine-grained access controls in days, not months, or years in some cases.
That's a nice tips to end the podcast. That don't reinvent the wheel. Alex, it was an absolute pleasure to chat with you.
Likewise, thank you for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. This was ShipTalk podcast, and I'm your co-host, Dewan Ahmed. I work at a company called Harness, the AI native software delivery platform. Thank you for joining, and find us wherever you find your podcast. Thank you.
Thanks.